Hello and welcome to the very first Canadian Whiskey Certification Program class publicly here on Camp Run Amok and Portland Cocktail Week. As you can see, I have two of the most incredible people who know more about Canadian whiskey and honestly whiskey period than almost anybody I know, which is quite an accomplishment. But we have a couple of things to get to before I introduce these beautiful people and before we get into their backgrounds. First up, if you want to get more content like this one, which after you're here for a few minutes, you're going to want a little bit more, make sure that you come here. Make sure to like us on Facebook, subscribe to our channel on YouTube, follow us on Instagram. And while you're here, while we're talking about this right now, leave any questions you have in the comments. It's my job to make sure that those comments and questions get asked. So as you're thinking about it, pop them in the comments. We'll take any and all questions that come our way. Okay, let's get to the good stuff now that all that business is out of the way. And I am so with you, Brittany. Let's go. All right. So today we are talking about Canadian whiskey, of course, but specifically we're talking about the history and category regulations. And to cover this incredible topic and one that's really complex are two people that I adore. You can see them right here. First up is Gina Fossitt. She's the Trade Education Brand Manager for Corby Canadian Whiskies. And we also have the very talented Dave Mitton, Global Brand Ambassador for Corby Canadian Whiskies. And I'm sorry that I had to read those because I can never remember your titles in total because they're very impressive and very long. So today, as I mentioned, is the very first official class of Canadian whiskey certification. This certification program is kind of incredible. Gina and Dave put together the most comprehensive guide to Canadian whiskey that I think has ever existed. And I am so excited to get to share all of this information with y'all over the next few weeks. And while some of the classes are going to be in private workshop spaces for those who apply to and were accepted into the program, I've got really good news for the rest of you. We also have classes like this publicly every week for the next couple of weeks. So you'll still get to see Gina and Dave tell you all of these amazing things about Canadian whiskey. All right. I think I covered the important stuff, but I'm reminding you all again, use those comments, ask those questions. You don't normally get access to these two incredible people. So Dave, Gina, you want to take it from here?
Sure, Dave, take it away.
Thanks so much for joining us, everyone, and thanks, Lindsay, for the wonderful introduction. Just quickly, this is a brainchild that Gina came up with close to 2 years ago, and we've been working on it for 20 months, taking a lot of test runs with a few different groups around the world, and it has grown into a 12-hour official certification on Canadian whiskey, 4 one-hour classes, which today is the first, and 4 two-hour workshops with some leading minds in the industry. And we couldn't be more excited to share this with our 100 certificate students and everyone else live here. This was designed to take you through the history and production, history and cocktails. Today, we're going to be covering a lot of history and production. It's a full class. So I'm going to stop talking and let Gina get to it.
Okay, I am equally or more excited than anyone can imagine to be launching this. Thank you for joining us. And we are going to dive in right now to history. Like Dave said, we'll be covering history today and category regulations. So a lot of what Dave and I do when we're building a lot of educational content or programming is we really set out to, debunk all the misconceptions around this category. There's really not a lot of education on the category out there. And so we really want to debunk the misconceptions that have come to life, got embellished or whatnot. The lines have gotten blurred through the years. We're here to, to debunk those and really educate on the category. So first up, we're going to look at important historical dates that really influence the category and the growth of Canadian whiskey from its beginnings. First, let's look at the Scottish Highland clearances. This was a time period where in Scotland, hundreds of tenants were being either kicked off their land, the leases were becoming more expensive for the land, and they decided to migrate to North America, both the US and Canada. Of course, neither of those countries were established as countries yet, but to North America land. With them, the Scottish brought their distilling techniques. They have a very deep history in whiskey and whiskey production. So they brought with them their distilling techniques and their pot stills, and really that was the beginning of whiskey production in Canada. Then we moved to the American Revolutionary War. So, we have the US fighting the British for their independence. The US won their independence and became a country from that war, as we all know. But how did this influence Canadian whiskey? What is the tie-in here, right? Well, after that war, we have a lot of British loyalists living in the United States. And we also have, soldiers from that war. It wasn't a quick plane ride home by any means during this time in the 1700s. So a lot of them migrated up north to Canada and made their homes in Canada. Now, why is this so influential again to whiskey? The English really had a big part in the growth of Canadian whiskey and its beginnings. What the English brought with them was the grain wheat. This is really important because it starts, it really starts what eventually became known as the iconic or traditional style of Canadian whiskey. When we think about wheat as a grain, it's very soft, sweeter style grain, right? Just like when you think about the breads, a lot of people use this analogy when talking about whiskey grains. Same grains in breads. Think about that, in that context. It's a softer, sweeter style of grain. Eventually, Canadian whiskey, the traditional style of it, really became known as a softer, sweeter style. And it has its beginnings really rooted in this wheat being the first commercially distilled grain in Canada. We're going to come back to that, but just keep that in mind. Okay, we're going to move to the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars. We have a brandy shortage during that time over in Europe. Now, it would make sense that they stayed a little more local with what they were going to drink next, something maybe like Scotch. However, there were some challenges to that. Highland Scotches, they were regulated on quantity that each distillery could produce, and they could not produce a lot during that time. And Lowland Scotches were taxed at a very high rate, making the whiskey they produced incredibly expensive. Now, there weren't any commercial distillers yet in Canada, but the first distillers who were distilling, on their farms kind of took advantage of this and started sending Canadian whiskey over to Europe. And so we start to see here really the beginnings of the world knowing and learning about other whiskey styles, lighter styles, softer styles. Then we have the Great Migration, which happened in the 1800s. Now, during this time period, this is, again, that huge English influence on the category. We have over 800,000 English migrating to Canada. Again, bringing with them wheat and their distilling techniques. Very important to building the category. Now, we're going to skip to the American Civil War in the 1860s. This became really important to the Canadian whiskey category. In fact, just leading up to this, through the Civil War, is really where we see the biggest growth period in Canadian whiskey history. Up to this day, this period, the mid-1800s, really was the biggest growth period of the category. And that's because, during the Civil War, we have the northern states fighting the southern states. Now, of course, their boundaries and their state lines were a little different than they are today. But either way, the northern states fighting the south, most American distilleries, certainly not all, but a lot of American distilleries were located at that time in the southern states. Well, the southern states certainly were not going to sell their whiskey to the northerners. If those southern distilleries even remained open during this time. Any distilleries, northern or southern in the US, had a very difficult time staying open. One, they didn't have enough workers. Everyone was going to war. And two, a lot of their equipment was being melted down for war purposes, ammunition, etc. So not many distilleries in the US really remained open, remained operating during the Civil War. Where did Americans, especially the Northerners, turn for their whiskey needs? Canada. The US became the biggest customer of Canadian whiskey during this time. And today, the US is still the biggest customer of Canadian whiskey. So very influential time period for the category there. And then we get to American Prohibition. Now, here is a major misconception that Dave and I were even talking about this morning. We continue to talk about this topic. But, you know, when you have now your biggest customer, the US, who legally cannot purchase your product, as a category, things start to dive pretty quickly. Now, there's all these movies and lots of drama and lots of hype around, you know, illegal, illicit sales, crossing the border, you know, all of the fun that goes with it in today's glamour of prohibition. But really, you know, there were a few distilleries that experienced that, you know, huge successes. Hiram Walker Distillery, our distillery, was one of those distilleries. But as a category, when we really look at Canadian whiskey across the board, as a category, it really took a nosedive. Unfortunately, many distilleries could not remain open during this time and had to shut the doors. So American Prohibition really affected Canadian whiskey in a negative way when we look at it as a whole, as a category. And then after Prohibition, you know, we really start to see that growth happening again. Canada has the distilleries that did remain open and were very successful during Prohibition. They had some aged whiskey, you know, and so they were selling it like hotcakes to the US because this flavor profile of barrel-aged whiskey at the time, you know, was a very, very high in demand, a very wanted product. And the US didn't have much aged whiskey right after Prohibition. Most of the distilleries were shut down. So, you know, we do see a lot of growth through the 50s into that kind of classic cocktail era, kind of having a rebirth in the 50s. We see that growth of the category again. Okay, so now let's go back to talking about the traditional style of Canadian whiskey, that iconic style that even today, you know, when somebody orders a Canadian whiskey and they're not specifying a style, what do they mean? So going back to really our first commercial distillers in the category, and these were the Molsons, Thomas Molson. Now, same Molson family as Molson beer that you may be familiar with, which has survived centuries at this point. But the distilling business only survived a few years, unfortunately. However, Thomas Molson was the first commercial distiller, and he was English. He was distilling wheat, so that lighter, softer grain style. And through the 1800s, now we really start to see a transformation. So a train system was being built across Canada. At the same time, we have Germans migrating into North America, the US on the East Coast, as well as Canada on the East Coast, but also into Canada on the West Coast after the California Gold Rush. Some Germans migrated north from California into the Vancouver area where there was yet another gold rush. Why is this important? The Germans brought with them rye, and rye has become very important to Canadian whiskey. It grows very well in Canadian soil and Canadian temperatures as well. So it has become an important ingredient. So as this train system was being built across the country, we see in many industries, innovation happening, ideas being shared, new products, new inventions happening. And that is not different in the whiskey industry. Now we start to see those wheat whiskeys, the English adding maybe 5 or 10% rye, which gives us a nice, big, spicy, bold character, but just a little bit, really change the flavor profile of their wheat whiskeys. And so at that time, if you were lucky enough to go into a saloon and see 2 barrels of whiskey on the back bar, because we didn't sell them in bottles at the time, but if you saw 2 barrels instead of 1, you either ordered a whiskey, which was wheat whiskey, or you ordered a rye, which was primarily wheat whiskey with just a little bit of rye added. And to this day, a traditional style of Canadian whiskey is primarily, it's actually corn today. I'll get into that in a bit, with just a little bit of rye. There's no regulation on a minimum amount of rye, and this is really an ode to this history and how the category developed. Now, like I said, eventually wheat turned to corn as a primary ingredient. And that's not to say everyone is doing that in Canada these days, but most distilleries have switched over to corn. You know, Canada got their hands on corn from the US, eventually began growing it themselves. Corn produces a higher yield. It's got a higher starch content, giving us more alcohol production at the end of the day. It is still a soft, even sweeter than wheat, sweet grain. So that soft, sweet style really, you know, has become the iconic traditional style of Canadian whiskey. And again, today, it's really primarily corn with just a little bit of rye. Now, there's many different styles of Canadian whiskey today, and we're gonna share those throughout the next throughout the coming weeks. But just to go over that kind of traditional style and when somebody is ordering a Canadian whiskey without specifying a style, really what they're referring to for the most part. Okay, so now let's look at some influential people. We call these our whiskey barons. And this is not, you know, the end-all be-all of list of influential people in Canadian whiskey history. There's certainly other characters that have influenced the category greatly. You know, Mr. Seagram, Sam Bronfman, to name a few. But these are the gentlemen that really shaped the history on the whiskeys that we'll be tasting. So first up is William Gooderham and James Wort Sr. Unfortunately, we certainly can't find a photograph of James Wort Sr. So you see Mr. Gooderham there. We have J.P. Weiser, Henry Corby, and Hiram Walker. So Mr. Gooderham and Mr. Worts, they were English. Again, here's that English influence. They migrated to the town of York, which is present-day Toronto. And they were men of many trades. And you're going to hear me say that as I go through all of these characters in Canadian whiskey history. But, you know, primarily they were grain millers. And, you know, when you think about the monetary system of the time, yes, there was money, but most people bartered. And so when you're a grain miller, a farmer is bringing his grain to the mill as payment. He's leaving behind a percentage of the milled grain as payment. Whatever the contract says, maybe 10%-ish, give or take. You start to stockpile a lot of milled grain that can rot and spoil. So what do you do with it? You start distilling whiskey. Gooderham and Worts started building their distillery in 1832, and they were distilling by 1837. In 1846, so only a few years later, they patented the Riley still. Now, what this is double column distillation. Aeneas Coffee patented a coffee still, which is a double column distillation as well. shortly before this. This was another type of double column distillation. And, this really was the introduction to changing the style, the traditional style, to what it has become today. Because when we take the whiskey through one column still, we are left with a full-bodied whiskey that retains its grain character, retains the yeast character, full-bodied, full-flavored. When we take it through another column still, now we start to strip out the grain characteristics, the yeast compounds, those flavor notes, and we're left with a very light, soft style of whiskey. This became hugely popular very quickly. In fact, distilleries, throughout Canada that invested in double column distillation equipment became very successful. And the others started to slowly fall off and not be able to survive, because really Canadians gravitated toward that lighter, softer style. And primarily using wheat at the time, transferring over to corn eventually, that lighter, softer, sweeter style, and you look at the whiskeys before this, they would have been pretty harsh, pot distilled most likely, and more of a moonshine character to them or quality, where then we start to take them through double column distillation and stripping all of that out. People are really able to sip on this more. By 1877, now here's where you see we've got the Riley still patented double column distillation really taking off in that style. That growth of Canadian whiskey category happening in the mid 1800s, Gutermann worts were set up for success. They were the largest distillery in the world by 1877. Next up is J.P. Weiser. He was from New York. His uncle, he went to work for his uncle, who eventually bought a distillery in Prescott, Ontario. Now, JP, John Phillip was his name, but he went by JP. He was a cattle breeder. And again, man of many trades, but his big business was cattle breeding. He had ranches as far west as Kansas, as far south as Florida. Huge business that his sons eventually took over to run for him, because he went to work for his uncle, and he saw that his uncle's distillery was using very high quality grains. The sludge, the spent grain at the bottom of the still after distillation is, even though we've taken all the alcohol and flavor components out of it that we've wanted to capture, what's left at the bottom of the still is full of nutrients and protein that is really great for animals to eat. He understood that higher quality grains in whiskey production meant higher quality spent grains, or that sludge. And for him, that meant higher quality animal feed for his breeding business. He was able to breed larger cattle. The breeding business became even more successful, and he ended up purchasing the distillery from his uncle in 1857. Now, he fell in love with making whiskey, so he focused his efforts on whiskey making. But by 1893, we did see the first bottles of J.P. Weiser's in the U.S. at the Chicago's World Fair. And next up is Henry Corby. So again, English, migrating to Belleville, Ontario. This is just east of Toronto a little bit. Again, a man of many trades. I can't list all of his businesses. Baker, miller. He shipped goods through the waterways. He had many, many businesses. Being a miller, again, he used some of that milled grain for his baking businesses, but he also began distilling whiskey at Alma Mills, which eventually became known as the Corby Distillery, and this was in 1859. By 1882, the town surrounding the distillery became known as Corbyville. He was incredibly influential in the community, not only in business, but also in politics as well, as were all of these men. Some of them, J.P. Weiser became a member of parliament. I mean, all of them, and Dave's going to dive into Guterham and Warts a little bit more later, but all of them very influential in their communities, politically, all across the board. And then finally, Hiram Walker. So he moved from the New England states, he was an American, to Detroit. It was a bustling area at the time. And he moved there with many businesses starting up again, but one of them being he was a grocer. Now think back, the monetary system of bartering for the most part. We've got farmers bringing in their goods, some of which were whiskeys that they were distilling on their farms from their leftover grain, to trade for groceries, necessities at the grocery store. Not all of these products were of good quality or consistent. And you'll see this, across many whiskey categories. When we talk about these historical, iconic whiskey blenders, many of them started out as grocers. Johnny Walker was one of them. There's many blenders that we can look back to their beginnings of being grocers. This is because these people had to, make something of good quality consistently so that they could sell the product and have a profit, make something of value to them. So they became very good at blending whiskey. Now, he opened his distillery. He really wanted to have his own operations. So in 1858, he opened his distillery, the Hiram Walker Sons and Distillery in Windsor, Ontario, which is right across the river from Detroit. Why wouldn't he open it in Detroit, Michigan? Well, if we look at our timeline, 1858, one reason being, at that time, there was a huge temperance movement in the US, had a lot of momentum. And if you thought that Prohibition was potentially right around the corner and could shut down your distillery, you wouldn't open it in the United States at that time. Another reason being the Civil War. It only happened 3 years later than this. The Civil War was being talked about. Those tensions, built up for years before the war actually happened. Another reason your distillery, and many distilleries were, shut down. You wouldn't open it in the United States in 1858. So he looked right across the river in Windsor. There was also a lot of other influences from Canada that made it a great place to open a distillery at that time. But those are the two major reasons you wouldn't open it in the US. Today, it is the longest operating distillery in Canada and one of the largest distilleries in North America. And we're really happy that, what you're going to see throughout this course, we've been able to capture a lot of video footage at the distillery. Hiram Walker really has the capability of large-scale production, but also has the capability to do very small craft, but small production runs. And so we can show you a lot of ways that things are being done across Canada in many different distilleries, and many styles of production as well across Canada. Aging whiskey. This is a fun one. So many people don't know that Canada was the first country to mandate a minimum aging requirement. Most people would think Scotch. I certainly did. Never really thought about it, to be honest. I just kind of assumed in the back of my head, or maybe Irish. But it was Canada. So let's look at the evolution of that. The first aging requirement came in 1887, when Canada mandated a 1-year aging law. And then just a few years later, in 1890, they upped it to a 2-year minimum aging requirement. By 1974, and this is the requirement today, it became a 3-year minimum age statement. Why? Why do this? Well, we just talked about our whiskey barons, right? Remember, I said very influential in their communities and politics. That means lawmaking as well. Now, these are the big guys. We've got the world's largest distillery from Gutermann and Worts. J.P. Weiser's had grown exponentially at that point. All of them had these very large, successful distilleries at this time. Remember the Canadian whiskey growth period from double column distillation. People, investing in that equipment really saw success, but not everyone could. However, there was still a lot of growth in the category. And, really to increase tax revenue, they decided to mandate a 1-year aging requirement. A lot of the little producers, what we would call craft distilleries or micro distilleries today, they really couldn't afford to hold on to their inventory for 1 year. They also just really couldn't afford the taxes. So a combination of shutting down because they couldn't afford to hold on to the inventory, or tax evasion and being shut down, really took out the competition for the big players. Before 1900, we were down to 19 distilleries in Canada. Just to give you perspective on that, by 1950, there were over 200 distilleries in Canada. So crazy jump in growth, and then a slow decline, and then at the end, we really chopped them down to under 19. And that was due to these minimum aging requirements coming into effect. Of course, affecting the flavor, the taste profile of the whiskey as well, and quality structure, premiumizing the category. All of that was very important to, these big players. They really wanted to premiumize the category and take out that competition. So let's dive into Prohibition again on a little bit deeper. So this is Harry Hatch. He exponentially influential during this time period. Harry owned a bar in Oshawa. So if you look at this map on Lake Ontario on the Canada side, you'll see Oshawa there. And that's where Harry's bar was. Most of his customers were fishermen who went back and forth between New York and Canada. Harry was also a salesman for the Corby Distillery. Owner of the Corby Distillery at that time was Mortimer Davis. So Harry decided to employ, I'll say, these fishermen to illegally sell his whiskey in the United States. They did so, hugely successful. Now here's where those few distilleries that thrived, here's where those stories come from. Hugely successful. I mean, this was crazy. There were like wars on the lakes, on the Great Lakes. The Navy was sent out after these fishermen over these alcohol sales. So being hugely successful, Harry Hatch went to Mortimer Davis and said, "Look what I'm doing for you. I would like a piece of the pie. I want some of the profits." He said no. And Harry Hatch left the company. He took out a loan and he purchased the Gutermann and Worts distillery. All those sales moved to Gutermann and Worts, of course. Hugely successful. So successful that only 3 years later, Harry was able to purchase the Hiram Walker Distillery for $14 million in cash. We're talking the 1920s. The distillery was actually valued at $28 million. He got it for half price. But he was able to purchase the Hiram Walker Distillery. And then eventually, toward the end of Prohibition, by this point, Mortimer Davis, who owned Corby, had purchased J.P. Weiser's and moved all of J.P. Weiser's production to the Corby Distillery. Harry Hatch purchased the Corby Distillery in 1932, therefore also purchasing the J.P. Weiser's brand. Today, any of the whiskeys that have kind of spawned from those distilleries and their histories are produced at the Hiram Walker Distillery in Windsor, Ontario. Okay, so we're going to take a brief look back at our timeline from the beginning and see where all of this sits. So we have Thomas Molson, first commercial distiller. And now we see our big players really coming into the folds and leading up to the mid-1800s, really set up for success of that giant growth period, right? Then those aging laws come in. By the late 1800s, the big five have control of the market. By 1900, Harry Hatch, he does his thing during Prohibition from 1923 when he purchased Gooderham and Worts all the way through 1932. And now we are ready to taste some whiskey with Dave. I'm going to let Dave take us through a couple whiskeys that, really speak to
Gina, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. We just have so many questions that I would love to ask a few of these questions before we get into the tasting. Okay. I have a feeling there are going to be more questions after Dave's section too.
All right.
So we're just going to go through these babies. All right. The first one, did the introduction of wheat outcompete any other dominant grains or crops in Canada at the time?
Really, this was a time when people were just starting to migrate to Canada. So I don't specifically know without going and doing a little bit more research, which we certainly will do that and get that answer to you. But, if I had to guess, probably not a ton of competition as far as whiskey making grains, because people weren't really distilling much before that. And then with the English really being the first distillers, what they knew how to work with most was wheat.
Excellent. The next one, I think I know the answer to, but I think someone wanted to just verify. Does the U.S. outpurchase Canada for Canadian whiskey?
Ooh, Dave, I'm going to let you take that one.
Yes. So, when I started this role 8 years ago, my background was running bars and restaurants. So I had a lot to learn about the Canadian whiskey category. The first thing that blew my mind was that the United States of America buys 24.1 million cases of Canadian whiskey every year. The only category that outsells Canadian whiskey in the United States is all of the American whiskey categories combined, all 36 categories, which sell 25 million cases. So, yeah, they're just a population. The state of Texas consumes more Canadian whiskey every year than all of Canada. But to be fair, there's about the same amount of people that live in the state of Texas as all of Canada.
That's fair. That's very fair. All right. The next question. Did vodka take over whiskey sales in Canada like it did in the US in the 1960s? It's a great question. Gina and I have this rule. If we don't know the answer to something, which we don't know the answer to everything, we will find out and get back to you. That sounds like that could be a thing, but let us find out and we will get back to you. Wonderful. The next question is, about when did corn become the dominant grain?
Ooh, when? Well, honestly, when you start to see corn being prominent in bourbon production and bourbon really coming to life in a bigger way than just farm distilleries, is really where we start to see that transformation starting to happen. It was a transformation. It wasn't just a shut off the spigot, start something else. And there certainly are today still distilleries that primarily use wheat. It's not, you don't have to do one or the other. It's just what people do primarily.
Absolutely. All right. The next question. With rye being so popular but low in enzyme activity, what was a common ratio when technology wasn't advanced enough for enzymes being accessible for purchase?
Ooh, this is a Dr. Dawn question.
That's what I thought.
It is also a rye whiskey question, which we're going to get into in week 4. So hold tight, because we talk a lot about enzymes and we break down lignin specifically. So hold tight on that question and we will come back to it.
I love that. Somebody asks, whiskey without the E versus whiskey with the E. Is there a dominant production narrative that determined when or why the E is omitted from spelling?
When or why? There's a lot of different stories of when or why. You know, Scotch and Irish whiskey definitely have their own, why with the Gaelic pronunciation and all of that, and Gaelic spelling of things and how things kind of transformed. And those influences certainly influenced how it's spelled in the US as well. We have a little bit more Scottish influence in Canada and a little bit more Irish influence in the US. Not to say there's not both, but that sort of did influence the spelling, at the end of the day.
That makes sense. All right, next one. At this time, in parentheses, late 1800s, I'm assuming, were they still distilling the rye separately and blending, or were they distilling rye and wheat together?
Ooh, they were actually making mash bills at one point, and then they decided to separate that out. I'm not going to go too much further into that because I know Dr. Don has that covered in one of the workshops coming up. So we're going to hold on that one as well. You guys have so many great questions. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves.
I totally understand that. All right, next up. Do you think that the major differences in definitions of rye whiskeys between Canada and the US hampers consumer education about Canadian whiskey?
Say that one more time. Make sure I understood the question fully.
Absolutely. Do you think that the major differences in definitions of rye whiskeys between Canada and the US hampers consumer education about Canadian whiskey?
I certainly have an opinion about this. Dave, I'm going to let you take it, and then I'll interrupt you if I feel strongly in another way.
I mean, Gina, I know Gina and I feel very similar when it's education. The more people know, the better. Canadian whiskey, certainly over the last few decades, all brands, all companies were very guilty of not educating enough about the category. This is why Gina and I are here. We have a full-time job on trying to learn how to educate everyone and spread the gospel. From our personal experiences, I would say yes, because I mean, I'm in the US all the time. Gina lives there when I'm not in lockdown. And, the American consumer, when they think rye, they think that 51% big, bold American rye, but not realizing the Canadian whiskey category, how there's so many. We have one category, which we're not going to get into too deeply right now, opposed to 36, but we have many different expressions of ways of making Canadian whiskey.
Definitely. All right. Only a few more, I promise. What is the second run stripping the ABV to, and how does that compare to other categories?
Ooh, we are diving into that next week, so stay tuned.
Amazing. What was the production volume in 1877 in liters per year?
Dave is going to go over that in the tasting, so hold tight.
Heck yeah.
So many good questions. So many great questions.
I know you've got a really smart group. I know a lot of still innovation happened in the 1800s. Did the Riley still catch on and become used across Canada?
Yeah, it was very popular. I mean, that was the start of double column distillation. And so that was really the biggest influence of double column distillation, in Canada.
Amazing. Are these age statements applicable to all Canadian whiskeys? Is there tricky labeling to skirt regulations like there is in the US?
Age statements on labels in Canada is the youngest whiskey in the bottle is the age statement on the label.
Awesome. And what type of barrels did they use to age in the 1920s?
Well, we will also get into that in the week of maturation.
Amazing. Well, you got all those questions, so I'm going to kick it back over to you, Dave, and I'm sure we're going to have a similar amount at the end of this session. So take it away.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And again, love the questions, guys and gals and everybody on. We're going to do a little bit of tasting right now. So for those of you in the certification course, you've got your kits at home. We're going to first do the JP Wiser's Deluxe. For all of you that don't have a kit, this is the JP Wiser's Deluxe. It is found across Canada, coast to coast. As Gina mentioned, Hiram Walker, our distillery, is the oldest continuously distillery in operation in Canada. JP Wiser's is the oldest continuously produced whiskey family in Canada. And it is adored from coast to coast. You see that a lot of bars and restaurants have it as a house whiskey. It is a household name among other big Canadian whiskey brands as well. This is the second best-selling whiskey in Canada. And it's our best expression of a traditional Canadian whiskey. As Gina kind of mentioned, Canadian whiskey is that soft double column distilled corn, generally with a little touch of rye to add spice. This is aged in ex-Canadian whiskey casks and bourbon casks, brings out dried fruit notes and autumn florals. This is a beautiful, soft, rich whiskey. It's a light amber color. I always get a little bit of vanilla, toffee, caramel. I almost get a creme brulee when I nose this, which might sound crazy to some, but also you can't be wrong when you're nosing and tasting whiskey. Whatever you're getting from it, that's the right answer. Now, it's medium and round. Really easy sipping. I get a bit of toasted oak, a little bit of toasty grains from there, lots of vanilla. Really great to sip on its own, works well in a Boilermaker. I know that's Gina's favorite way to drink this whiskey. Generally, traditional Canadian whiskeys are used in highballs. You'll hear a lot of people drink Canadian whiskey with ginger ale. A real common drink request across Canada is a rye and ginger. And that would be JP Wiser's Deluxe, traditional style Canadian whiskey with some bubbles. But you can have a lot of fun in cocktails too. Normally, where it's such a light style, you don't pair it up with big vermouths or herbal liqueurs, so it's overpowered. But for instance, tomorrow we're going to see what Kelsey Ramage gets up to with the JP Wiser's Deluxe. That's going to be a lot of fun. Any questions on the JP Wiser's Deluxe right now?
Not at the moment.
Not yet.
But
so
give everybody a second to taste and type.
You all know your traditional style Canadian whiskey right now.
Oh, there we go. What is the mash bill?
So again, Canadian, which we're going to get into production next, but so Canadian whiskey does not have a mash bill where certainly at our distillery and most distilleries in Canada, but we can't speak for all of them, all of our grains are fermented separately, distilled separately, aged separately, and then blended together. That's why we have master blenders in Canada. But easy answer is this is a majority of that soft column distilled corn with just a little pinch of rye added to it. A lot of traditional style Canadian whiskeys will be less than 5% added in. I hope that answers your question. And next up, we are going to taste the Gooderham and Worts. If we're ready for that, Lindsay.
I think it's time. Let's do it.
So Gina mentioned Gooderham and Worts, the gents coming over from Suffolk, England to the town of York, which is now the city of Toronto. They showed up in 1832. They were grain millers. They were very successful. They were the people, if you lived in the area, you'd bring your grain to, they'd make a flour. Now, back then, you weren't just paying them money to do this. You were bartering. You might trade back some of that milled grain that they would sell in their grocery stores that they owned. And they became very successful at this. So successful that they weren't able to sell the product fast enough. So rot was setting in from bad weather. Rodents were getting into it. Essentially, they were throwing profit down the drain. The short version of the story is they started distilling whiskey. They started building a distillery. If anyone has ever been to Toronto or plans on coming to Toronto, we're quite a large city. In total, we're 7 million people, about 3 million downtown. We have 116 neighborhoods, I think. One of the neighborhoods is called the Distillery District. Now, it's an entire neighborhood in the downtown core, and that is where the Gooderham and Worts Distillery used to be. It is still there intact. On the outside, it still looks like 1832. A lot of American films, timepieces are filmed there. Inside, it's a lot of beautiful shops and restaurants and bars to go visit, but beautiful place to see if you're ever visiting the city. Now, they had a great impact on the city. Gooderham was actually one of our mayors at one point. They were on our money. A lot of the big structural buildings that you'll see with red brick across the city of Toronto, those are Gooderham buildings. Churches, they had a hand in everything. And by the year 1877, they did become the world's largest distillery. And I think somebody asked earlier how much they were producing. It was 2.5 million gallons annually, which was a very large amount of whiskey at that time. Now, to get into tasting, as the J.P. Weiser's Deluxe being that traditional style, very light, soft, easy sipping whiskey, Gooderham and Worts, I'd say it's probably one of our most complex blends of whiskey. This is a 4-grain, 7-distillate, aged in 2 types of cask whiskey. It's bottled at 44.4 ABV or 90 proof. The 44.4 ABV is Dr. Don Livermore's cheeky way of doing a 4-grain whiskey. Now, all of this creates a beautifully balanced, complex whiskey. It's this gorgeous gold. I think luxurious gold is what our tasting notes say. Love the word luxurious. Now, on the nose, this is one of those whiskeys where I feel like I always walk through all of the grains. On the nose, I get like that breadiness from the wheat. It's like a loaf of bread almost. Certainly get a little bit of nuttiness coming from the barley. And then at first sip, I get a lot of apple, some baking spices, a little bit of honey, certainly some of that vanilla coming through on the brand new American oaks that it's aged. 90% of it is aged in. The rest in ex-bourbon cask, which get a little bit of dried fruit element from it. And then it always finishes off. I get a little bit of that warming effect from the rye grain that really, this time of year, it's a little cold out. It's not such a bad thing. And we've often noticed, this has been sold in Canada a few years. Gina and I have been working with it in the US the last couple of years. We've really found that bourbon connoisseurs, bourbon drinkers gravitate towards this brand. Out of all of our 9 we'll be going through this course more than any others. It's majority of that big soft doubles distilled corn. You've got almost equal amount of a column and pot distilled rye, column and pot distilled wheat, and column and pot distilled barley that we just walked through. So it's a perfect sipper on its own, but we've also noticed a lot of bartenders making cocktails with it. Obviously, people like to be a little cheeky by making a Toronto cocktail, which is a bitter variation of a Manhattan. And even some who have figured out that the first documented place for a sour was in the year 1856 in a Toronto saloon. So where we've been producing whiskey since the 1830s, I'd like to think that saloon was making a sour with some Gooderham and Worts. So we see lots of whiskey sours.
It was the local whiskey.
It really was.
So why not? Why wouldn't it have been, right?
One of my favorites.
Dave, I have one question on the Gooderham and I have a couple on the Deluxe.
Okay.
So on Gooderham, is it also aged in ex-Canadian and ex-bourbon barrels?
The two, it's 90% brand new American oak and 10% ex-bourbon casks. If I said Canadian whiskey casks, I apologize.
Then on Deluxe, why handle production and maturation for each grain separately?
Oh, Professor Fossitt is going to get into this. This is what the next 3 weeks is all about. But ultimately, I don't want to spoil anything for Gina or our master blender, Dr. Dawn, but it's a painter's palette. You know, we can do 1 distillate whiskeys. You could do 2 distillate whiskeys. We have an 11 distillate whiskey. Like it leaves options for everything. We can distill any way we want. We can age any way we want with any type of cereal grain. Again, I'm going to shut up so Professor gets to get into that.
Amazing. How many years does it rest in that bourbon cask?
Oh, the Gooderham and Worts, the youngest blend in the Gooderham and Worts. The wheat and barley is generally 3 to 4 years in the ex-bourbon casks. And then the New American Oak is a 10-year. And as Gina touched on earlier, we can't call it a 10-year whiskey because the youngest in the blend is 3-year.
Fantastic. Last question. What is the percentage of each product, each grain in the blend?
Great question. And now this is, again, we're going to let Dr. Dawn really, I don't want to steal thunder. This is what he's going to get into as a master blender. He does not speak in percentages, and he will explain thoroughly why when it comes down to distillation, and he's going to get very scientific. But the majority of this, think of as almost half of it is that soft corn, the rest being almost an equal amount of that rye, and then small amounts of the wheat and barley. It's probably less than 5% in there.
Fantastic. And then one more Gooderham question before I send you back to taste a little more. How many times do you refill barrels before they're retired? Until
they fall apart. And again, that might sound crazy. I mean, when I first heard it, it does. But one of the workshops is Dr. Dawn's dissertation. The man has a PhD on what wood does to whiskey. So there is no point in Gina and I going into depth into it. But I think it will surprise most people. I know I was shocked. I watched Gina's jaw hang a little bit when we first went through it. Just because it's been used quite a few times doesn't mean it's not good. Trust me.
Amazing. Well, I'll let you go back to it. Thanks for taking these questions.
All right. So now we are going to dive into category regulations. And before we get started on this, although it's not nearly as long as history section, I do want to let you all know that we are going to go over the 1 hour time. So just have that in mind if you need to dip out or whatever. This will live on Facebook and YouTube and all the wonderful places that the recording will live on. Okay. So category regulations, let's really come to understand before we dive into production next week in a more detailed way. Let's really come to understand the liquid in the bottle. What are the rules for it to be labeled a Canadian whiskey? I'm going to do a lot of comparisons to Canada versus the US. Why? Is because, like I said earlier, Dave and I are constantly debunking all of these misconceptions. And we find that most North Americans, Canadians and Americans, really understand American whiskey better than they understand Canadian whiskey. And so just coming from that place and where the lines might get blurred a little bit, we're going to do a comparison in a lot of ways. So first, let's look at the category. In Canada, there is one regulated category of whiskey. In the US, I have 36 listed here. That should say 36 plus because it's very hard to actually count how many separately regulated categories there are because of the way the TTB lists them. There's over 36. There's more being added all of the time. I mean, American single malt, any second now we're going to have those regulations, right? So they're just constantly adding more categories. So just in comparison, looking at that, the title of the Canadian whiskey category is Canadian whiskey, Canadian rye whiskey, or rye whiskey. So look how important the rye grain, just flavoring that traditional style, that soft, sweet style a little bit, look how important that became to the category. They've listed it twice in the title. I'm not going to list all the American whiskey categories. This is not an American whiskey course. There's a lot of them: bourbon, rye, straight whiskeys, wheat whiskeys, blended whiskeys. The list goes on and on and on and on, right? Okay, but both countries do recognize and adhere to international whiskey categories and their regulations. So what that means is if you buy a bottle of scotch in the United States, that liquid is adhering to all of Scotland's regulations for scotch. If you buy a bottle of bourbon in Canada, that bottle of bourbon is adhering to all of the United States regulations for bourbon. In Canada, the national spirit is Canadian whiskey. In the US, out of all of our categories, we have chosen bourbon as our native spirit. America's native spirit is what we call it. Okay, so the actual regulations, the rules. First up is that it must be made from cereal grain. This is across the board world whiskey categories. Whiskey is made from grain: corn, wheat, rye, barley, quinoa, oats, you name it. If it's a cereal grain, we can make whiskey out of it. Must be aged in wooden barrels, less than or equal to 700-liter barrels, for a minimum of 3 years. So it doesn't state what type of wood. I know that was part of one of the questions. That Canadian whiskey can be aged in brand new American oak, ex-bourbon cask, red oak, cherry, Hungarian oak, ex-tequila barrels, wine barrels. I don't know, you name it. If it's wood, you can age whiskey in it. Under 700 liters. That's a giant barrel. We're going to get into that a little bit more detail in the week of maturation, but the regulation minimum of 3 years there. Must be mashed, fermented, distilled, and aged in Canada. That seems obvious. It's Canadian whiskey. But if we compare to American whiskey, for example, not all American whiskey categories are like that. For instance, many Canadian distilleries, Hiram Walker included, produce rye whiskeys or other whiskeys, but rye is a very good example. Ferment it, distill it, ship it to a U.S. producer, aged in the U.S., labeled as an American rye or an American straight rye by regulation in the U.S. In Canada, that cannot be done. To be labeled a Canadian whiskey must be from beginning of mashing all the way through aging. That must happen in Canada. Must be bottled at a minimum 40% ABV. Again, this is pretty standard across world whiskey categories. There's a few small exceptions here, but in the bottle at 40% ABV is the standard. May contain spirit caramel for coloring. Now, this is something that a lot of distilleries or producers don't really like to talk about. We don't really understand why. It's very commonly used amongst many categories: Scotch, Irish, most American categories, unless they're straight whiskeys, can use caramel coloring. Canadian whiskey can as well, Japanese, etc. And really, it's just important to understand what spirit caramel does. It does not add flavor, and I know there has been debate about this, but we can go in depth about it with Dr. Don in one of the workshops. He cannot molecularly measure flavor from spirit caramel. Molecularly, the structure of the compound is exactly the same as the compounds we get from the wood when we caramelize or char the barrel and end up caramelizing the wood sugars, those carbohydrates. When we do that, it's the same molecular structure. It is not adding any flavor. It is simply adding color. Now, why add color? Because whiskey barrels don't all age the same. You might have a period of weird weather. The barrels aren't breathing as much, or, lots of variables that can happen. And one barrel sitting right next to a different barrel might come out looking different and tasting the same. As human beings, we shop, we drink, we eat first with our eyes. We're visual beings. And so when I go to the retail store and, go for that bottle of whiskey that I've purchased 5 times before this, and it looks slightly different, my immediate reaction is that something's wrong or something's changed. And I'm a little like, I came here to get that, what I know, what I love. Even though flavor-wise, it may not have changed at all. So, it's really just a color component, the spirit caramel, to adjust the color very, very slightly. And then we have the 9.09% rule. Now, this is very unique to Canada. The regulation states that up to 9.09% of the liquid in the bottle may be either a minimum of 2-year age spirit or a wine. Now, where in the heck did this come from? That growth period of Canadian whiskey. We have recipe books from Hiram Walker in our archives that have cognac, rum, other ingredients being added that were more expensive than the whiskey he was producing. And what he was doing was trying to gain those drinkers into the whiskey category, much like whiskey producers do today, often with flavored whiskeys, but also different maturation styles or all kinds of different innovations that come out, always trying to gain new whiskey drinkers into the category. Expand the market, right? Expand your consumer. So that's what they were trying to do. But as the category grew so quickly and so big, they realized that some distillers might take advantage of this. They might try to cover up poor quality whiskey with some other ingredient. So then they decided to regulate it. They wanted to keep Canadian whiskey as a premium product. So they decided to regulate this, that for every 100 liters of whiskey, you could add another 10, up to another 10, of either minimum 2-year age spirit or wine. The spirit could be bourbon, again, tequila, cognac, scotch, you name it, up to 9.09% of that liquid could be the spirit or wine. So this is one of the biggest misconceptions we come across. Not that people really know the 9.09% rule, but they don't understand what's in the bottle. And quite often we come across, well, those Canadians, they can just throw anything in that bottle. There's probably neutral grain spirit in there or whatever they decide to say. But I'm going to reiterate this. It cannot contain any other ingredients. Our biggest misconceptions are juice, sugar, neutral grain spirit. All no, cannot do it. Now, this is opinion. But again, Dave and I have a lot of conversations about this. We really feel like the lines got blurred here across the border, because when we look at American whiskey and we look at American blended whiskey, up to 80% of the liquid in an American blended whiskey can be neutral grain spirit. In Canada, that is not true. Cannot be. If it is Canadian whiskey in any way, shape, or form, it follows the Canadian regulations. Okay, and lastly, we're going to touch on flavored whiskey. This isn't a big component of the class, but it is a part of whiskey culture today, and so it is something that we should talk about. So in looking Canada versus the US again, sweetening agents has to have at least 2.5% of a sweetening agent in Canada. Could or could not have sugar in the US for a flavored whiskey. A lower ABV minimum in Canada at 23% in the bottle, 30% in the US. Now this one is like pretty vague. You get a lot of leeway on this one. Can contain natural or artificial flavorings, contains natural flavoring materials. the definition of what those things are can get there's a lot of give and take on that end of things. They both can contain caramel coloring, just like the whiskeys can. So when we go back to our misconceptions on Canadian whiskey of juice, sugar, or NGS, in flavored whiskey, those are all okay. Okay, I am going to pass it back to Dave once more to take us through some fantastic JP Weisers, the 15-year-old, the old-fashioned, and the Manhattan bottle cocktails.
Thanks, Gina. Oh, wait, I see Lindsay.
Hello. I have a few questions for you, but not too many this time. So before we hop back to Dave, Gina, as consumers demand more and more transparency, do you think the regulation of Canadian whiskey may change to be more descriptive or categorical? If not, do you see brands stepping up with more information to catch more savvy customers?
I mean, I'll give you my opinion, and I think we should also ask Dr. Don this question in one of the workshops, because he's going to have a very strong opinion about this as well. I actually don't think that the regulations will change much. I mean, everything is evolving, right? But I don't think because of this. The regulations in Canada are really set to, give blenders the ability to innovate, to make more styles, to be creative, and really expand the breadth of styles in the category. And so, when you start tightening those regulations up, you start losing the ability to be as creative. So I don't, in my opinion, I don't see that will happen much. Brands being more, informative about what they're doing, that's brand by brand. I've worked for many different brands, and they all operate very differently from one another. And so that's really just a brand owner choice, nothing more.
And I need to add completely agree with what Gina said. One thing we are noticing, I don't think the rules and regulations will change either. But what we are seeing are at like the Canadian Whisky Awards put on by Davender Kergamo, or the World Whisky Awards over in the UK. They're almost making up specific categories for Canadian whiskeys. So they're not putting like Lot 40, which is 100% rye, in with a category of like lighter, softer corns. They're kind of creating their own, which makes it a lot more fair, I believe, for all of the Canadian whiskey brands across the land to compete. But also another thing to keep in perspective is when I'm down in the US, if I'm in a liquor store in Dallas, Texas, I'll walk in and see 30 brands of Canadian whiskey I've never heard of and that are not sold in Canada. And, that's companies buying whiskey from large distilleries, probably some of ours, and not educating on this. And, as Gina said, we need all brands to raise the tides and, to educate. And we're seeing it happen more. Until everyone's doing it, Gina and I will always be here, repeating ourselves every year.
I love that. Do the regulations mean you can buy grain from outside of Canada, or does it have to be grown in Canada?
You can buy grain outside of Canada. In fact, a few years ago when there was a lot of rain and a lot of rye fields kind of rotted and had spoilage, it just didn't meet our quality standards. And we'll get into this next week with production more. But, we really, at Hiram Walker, we really try to source our grain as locally as possible. However, we're not willing to give up quality. And so we went across the border to Michigan and got some rye to make some good rye whiskey. So the regulations don't, it really starts at mashing. And once you start the mashing process, that is where the regulation of being in Canada begins.
And to even add to what Gina said locally, this is something Dr. Don always says, we always buy local. Yes, marketing wise, it sounds amazing. Business wise, it makes more sense financially. But for us local, like being situated the most southern tip of Canada, local is all of Ontario, where we generally buy our grain, but local is also Michigan, Illinois. Like we're very close to everything. But generally we do buy from Ontario if we can, if the weather and the season allows us.
Fantastic. How much percent by volume of spirit caramel can be added in Canadian whiskey, or is there no stated range?
I don't know the answer to that. I will find it out, unless Dave, you know the answer to that. But I know we honestly, what's been described to me one time was if you were sitting in a ballroom and you had a coffee cup and the ballroom was full of whiskey and you had a coffee cup of spirit caramel, give or take the batch, that's about how much is being used. Very little. It's really just a minor adjustment, you know.
My similar story to Gina was 8 years ago when I started working with the company. I went with my nose turned down as a bartender, thinking, oh, caramel coloring, and watched Dr. Don roll his eyes, and he opened palm of my hand, and he had we were in the blending room, and he squirted caramel coloring in my hand, and he said, drink it. I did, and I was like, water has more flavor, like no flavor whatsoever. But making a simple 750 ml bottle, we took a pin drop to just even it out. So I think Don's going to get into this because he's got a whole new, I don't want to give it away, but he's got a whole new thing on caramel coloring he's adding to his geekiness. So he's going to get into it.
Well, I'm looking forward to that. Amazing. The next question: what are some good modern examples of Canadian whiskeys that take advantage of the 9.09% rule?
I think that this is the perfect segue into Dave's first tasting.
Yes.
It really is. But there are some brands out there who, it's a great question. There are some brands who are starting to embrace it and put it on the labels. Some put it on the label but don't embrace it. For instance, we're going to be going through 9 whiskeys over the next few weeks. Right now, we're going to try the one whiskey that we take advantage of the 9.09 rule. And that is our, look at the sun on this glass, the JP Weiser's 15-year-old, which is currently, I got to think, because as a global guy, this is sold across Canada in most provinces, and it's in the US. I couldn't tell you every state it's in right now, but we are trying to get it out everywhere. To be quite honest, this is kind of the whiskey. If you look at our marketing, it says it's a luxury expression of Canadian whiskey, which, it's true. It's made in a traditional style where it's the majority of that soft double column distilled corn whiskey, 2 distillates of that, and a once column distilled rye added to it. So very similar in the amount of blending that goes into the JP Weiser Deluxe, mostly corn, a little bit of rye. Now, this is aged in 3 types of casks. So you've got brand new American oak, and you're getting all your beautiful vanilla, warming caramel and toffee sweetness. You're doing ex-bourbon casks, which you're getting all your dried fruit notes, and your ex-Canadian whiskey casks, where you're getting a lot of autumn florals from that. Now, this is, as I said, the 9.09 rule. As Gina mentioned, this became a regular thing in the early 1900s where blenders were trying to attract drinkers from other spirit categories. So rum drinkers, cognac drinkers, bring them into the Canadian whiskey world, see if they like that. Now, we had a pretty prominent cocktail historian in the US bring up once that if you look into it, rums and cognacs in the early 1900s were some of the most expensive spirits you could buy at the time. So the fact that the Canadian whiskey blenders were adding it in was not to save any money. And still to this day, it's not to save a buck, it's to add something. It's a really cool rule that we have. So Dr. Don, after this corn and rye has been aged in the 3 different types of casks, Dr. Don adds in less than 2% of a sherry wine. Now, we can't call it a sherry wine because it is made in Canada, so it'd be an Apera wine, but that adds, a little bit. Well, let's walk through it. Let's nose it, shall we? It's this beautiful mahogany color. I get a lot of toffee. I get a little bit of banana, sweet caramel right away. A little bit of that warming rye spice. First sip, it's soft. It's got a nice mouth feel. It's medium bodied. I get more spice on my first sip than I do on the nose. That's for sure. And then you get a little bit of, I get a little bit of golden tobacco, a little pecan. I think those flavors, that sweetness comes from the less than 2% of the sherry wine added in. Plus, I'm a big sherry fan. If I'm not drinking Canadian whiskey, it's kind of my go-to if I'm looking for low ABV. And this is one that we do often recommend. Sip it on its own. I mean, sure, I've had bartenders make me an old fashioned with it. It's great. But price point wise, makes more sense to sip on with a nice beer in the summertime. This is actually one, like if I'm going to someone's cottage, this is one of our expressions I'll usually bring because it's a crowd pleaser. Most older generations and younger generations do like this whiskey.
I find in the US a lot of bourbon drinkers like this whiskey. Bourbon drinkers who kind of want to explore the category or just try something new. This is a really great direction to kind of point them in.
Absolutely. Any questions on this one?
Not at the moment. We do have a couple of questions from the previous section, but they all look like questions that are going to be answered to me as we move along. We do have one from Baker. Do you know what style of sherry or wine is added?
Gina, it is made here in Canada, so it's not, I can't tell you. We'll get into some barrel finishing with different types of sherries later on in the course, but this is simply, it's called an Apera wine made here in Canada. And I think it's made for a lot of these purposes for Canadian whiskey makers to blend in to their expressions. So I can't say it's an Oloroso or a PX.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a sweeter style of sherry, like if you were to compare to sherry. But, made in fact, I think it was like 2000, it was either 2012 or 2014. I keep getting those dates mixed up, but that's really when the regulation came into effect that you couldn't call it a sherry unless it was made in Spain. So before that, we were calling it sherry. It's made in that same style of production. This would be a sweeter style of that, but by regulation, we would call it an Apera wine.
Yeah. And I mean, just for comparison too, again, we've got a rule. We don't like bring up other brands because we don't know enough about them. But I mean, there are Canadian whiskeys out there that blend in tequila. There are Canadian whiskeys that blend in bourbon. There are Canadian whiskeys that blend in cognac, or different types of wines and styles. I couldn't comment on how much of each, but we're starting to see people embrace the rule a little bit more because you can get really innovative with it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
One other thing to note with that rule is that it's also a consistency factor. Years ago, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, if I had to guess, I was at a whiskey fest working the table. Dr. Don was standing beside me, and the master distiller for Abelauer was at the table next to us, and they were chit-chatting back and forth, and I was totally eavesdropping on their conversation while I was pouring whiskey. And, the Abelauer distiller was saying, wow, I can't believe you can blend in these flavors when I have to use a finishing barrel, and it's just not as consistent of how much port or, pick the finishing barrel, whatever, how much I'm going to get out of that barrel. And so then blending the barrels becomes this big thing, and it's very difficult to make it very consistent. And I know that was kind of something that caught my ear, I never thought of it in that way, that, in Canada, they really do have the advantage, if they want to use it, to make super consistent flavor profiles, and not having to tweak it a little each time.
Well, I cannot tell you how much I've learned, so I can only imagine how excited everyone is about the last hour and a half that we got to spend with the two of you. So thank you both for all of the time and all of the work that went into this presentation. And the good news for all of you watching is that this is the first of many classes that you're going to get to see here. So if you haven't already, make sure you go and like and subscribe. Very easy to do on Facebook. You're going to like. On YouTube, you'll subscribe. So you're up to date. You know exactly when these classes are going to be. And if you want more opportunities like this one, or potentially, hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll get to do this again. Make sure you sign up for our newsletter, which you can just inquire through the Facebook or Instagram. All right. Well, thank you both. Thank you, Gina. Thank you, Dave, for all of the time today and the incredible information. Is there anything that you'd like to leave us with?
Just thanks for joining us. I had a ton of fun.
Absolutely. And we'll hopefully see you all next week, and tell your friends.
Yeah.
Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.